All I require is to sit in the sun, read my book, alone.
I will leave you now to your book.
That is all I ask.
Books, young man, books, thousands of them. If time wasn't so important, I'd show you something. My library, thousands of books.
My name is Peter, and I'm the host of this Trek Book Club podcast. This is a companion podcast to the Trek Book Club on X, formerly known as Twitter, where we read and discuss Trek books approximately every 6 weeks. To learn more about the club, go to @Trek Book Club on X. We are recording this episode after the season finale of Lower Deck Season 4, Old Friends, New Planets. So this is a warning that we may discuss spoilers, and we may also touch upon other parts of the Star Trek universe. This is a spotlight episode in which I will be chatting with Michael Foy, a friend of the Trek Book Club, who has written a series of novels and short stories which incorporate his Star Trek fandom into his lead character, Cord Devlin. Hi, Mike. Welcome to the pod, and thank you for joining me on this episode.
Hi, Peter. Nice to be here and good to talk with you instead of tweeting.
Yeah, that's great. So I'm sure we'll have some interesting conversation talking about your writing and your Star Trek fandom and how you kind of merge those two together. We ask our first-time guests to give their Trek origin story and their Trek novel origin story. So can you start us off with telling us how you got into Trek and how you started reading Trek novels?
Sure. Well, I'm going to risk giving away my age, but back in the misty past, when I was a kid, my parents, and I don't know if this still applies to kiddom these days, but my parents enforced a strict bedtime. And mine just happened to be set at a time when the Star Trek show was just coming on. I never knew it existed. This now is back in 1966. Up to that point, I'd been watching silly shows like Lost in Space and nothing that had anything to do with any intelligent rhyme or reason. But one night I was being very quiet and tried to be invisible, because when you're a kid, if you're invisible and you're not attracting attention to yourself, you can go a little bit past your bedtime. So this one night, I guess I pulled it off and they forgot about me. And I happened to witness for the very first time the first few minutes of Star Trek. And I was amazed at it. It blew me away. And I think the thing that I loved about it was, instead of the monster fests that was science fiction up to that point, here was a group of people in an organization that was making their own way throughout the stars, throughout the galaxy. And they weren't cannon fodder for space monsters, etc. That and the design of the ship and just the way they worked together, and again, the design of the ship that wasn't your typical rocket with vanes and tail fires coming out of the end and landing on them and everything. Like I said, it just blew me away. So thereafter, my bedtime was changed, not because I was very disobedient, but I just whined and just created this commotion so that one night per week, I got to stay up for the whole of Star Trek. This sounds corny, but it was like a life-changing experience for me. I thought, wow, this is why I need more of this. I might want to read more of this and eventually, as I grew up, write more of this. I think your other question, I read a lot of science fiction because of Star Trek. I wouldn't necessarily say that I went overboard with Trek-specific novels, but certainly it juiced my imagination or my need to learn more about reading about what wasn't normal in everyday life and to live these adventures in space and in time in some cases. So for the books that I write these days, they're all science fiction except for maybe one.
Do you have a favorite character in Star Trek or a favorite episode when you started to get into the series?
I do, as a matter of fact. And if somebody asked me that these days, if I've had a bad day and I need a Star Trek fix that evening, the equivalent of comfort food for me is got to be the original series. And I loved a lot of different episodes. The one with Khan Noonien Singh, Space Seed is
Yes,
one of them.
one of my favorites as well. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
it's pretty neat. I did like, even though the third season of the original series wasn't thought to be the best written, I did in fact like Spectre of the Gun, that talked about the gunfight at the OK Corral with Kirk and Spock and the rest of the landing crew as participating in that gunfight. But I'll tell you, if there's one single episode across all the series that I really wear out on the TV, it's got to be Deep Space Nine's In the Pale Moonlight. That moved me somehow. And when I saw Captain Sisko's angst at the shady things they had to do to bring the Romulans into the war with the Dominion, I thought that was very compelling. Even though what he was doing was all for the right reasons, to try to save the Alpha Quadrant, the Romulans Federation, and the Klingons, as well as the Cardassians, he still struggled mightily with his conscience about lying to the Romulans to get them to jump into the war.
Mhm.
And Garrick was such a terrific character in general.
Mhm.
It
Mhm.
really was a bit of a departure, but a fun departure from the normal Federation ethos of being the good guys. I do like Strange New Worlds,
Mhm.
the Captain Pike character. And I think that both Jeffrey Hunter's portrayal of Captain Pike as well as Anson Mount's in the newest series, even though they're kind of different portrayals, but I still think that it enhances the character. And Anson Mount's foreknowledge of his accident to put him in that chair when he's disfigured, I think is an incredibly compelling plot element.
Really quickly, In the Pale Moonlight is my favorite Deep Space Nine episode.
Yeah.
I really, really enjoyed it. Like you said, Star Trek does the shades of gray or the
Mhm.
moral episodes every so often, and that's one of the best ones. It's probably my favorite non-TOS scene.
Mhm.
Is actually the one with Garrick and Captain Cisco at the end
At the end
in
in the
the
tailor shop.
tailor
Oh
shop.
yeah.
In the tailor shop when Cisco came and punched him. And then Garrick explained, that's why you came to me,
Yeah.
isn't it? Because I could do the things you weren't capable of doing. And
That was
then
brilliant.
between the writing and Andrew Robinson
Oh
and
yeah.
Avery Brooks talking about it and
Mhm.
how that scene ended when Andrew Robinson as Garrick would say, "Work, you're going to bring the Romulans into the war," and all it cost was one criminal, and then
Yeah.
the self-respect of one Starfleet officer. That was really well
Oh yeah.
done. Even to this day, every so often, I would just pull that clip on YouTube and just watch those few minutes because it's such a
Oh
scene.
yeah. Very
Yeah,
definitely.
yeah,
I
and
was going to say the other aspect of that, and I think the advent of Section 31 came after that episode. But I think if it
mhm.
wasn't for that, Section 31 might never have come along, because that just showed that, yeah, the Federation has a dark side. They'll do what it needs doing to protect themselves.
Mhm.
I actually felt bad when Sloan got killed at the end.
The novels that brought Section 31 back, the miniseries in the literary universe.
I'm going to have to look that up.
Novels. Yeah. I think it's called Star Trek Section 31. And the novels had different eras of stories related to Section 31.
It's interesting when they were talking about after that episode when Odo said to them, it just makes perfect sense that there would be a Section 31, the Federation that would need something like that because the Romulans have the in other words,
Yeah.
all the great powers seem to have something like this that operates outside their charter. So yeah, Odo brought up a good point.
With Strange New Worlds, I really like Captain Pike as well. He's probably one of my favorite of the characters since the revival of Star Trek. So I think Anson Mount does a great job. And in TOS, we've got a small peek at Captain Pike through the menagerie or the cage. But here we get more development of that character, and Strange New Worlds does a good job with him. I'd be curious in seeing how his arc
Yes,
continues. Yeah.
me too. Should be interesting to see how he deals with, or if he avoids his fate.
Mhm.
That's still a question.
That was a focus on equality of mercy. The last episode in season one is a reinterpretation of the Balance of Terror
Oh
episode
yes,
with the
yep, right.
Romulans. That was really, really good. So we'll see. Yeah. Although I think with the last episode of season two with the cliffhanger,
Mm,
it's going to be a little while before we see how it concludes. So, but I'm
yeah.
looking forward to seeing how that happens as well.
Exactly.
Mike, for the Cord Devlin novels, what led you to create them to start with? How do you determine
Mhm.
the plot and characters, and then how you weave your Star Trek interests and fandom into the stories and into the
Sure.
characters?
The Cord Devlin Adventure series. That's fun for a Trekkie because Trek themed anomalies intrude into our reality in our present 21st century day life. And I'll give you an example of one of my stories. Tombstone, Arizona, for example, a working phaser gets dug up at an archaeological site, the site where the gunfight at the OK Corral actually took place. And fans of the old show will recognize that there was an episode devoted to that called Spectre of the Gun. So I take that a little step further in a short story that I wrote, whereby the NSA gets wind of this real working phaser and call upon and assign one man that they know who can make sense of this craziness because he is obsessed with Star Trek and thus the character in the series. So it's fun to write.
That's one thing I enjoyed when I was reading your novels, short stories, was how you weave Star Trek in the narrative, in the plot. So can you talk a little bit about that aspect of writing and
Yeah.
how you decide bringing in some of the episodes or storylines? Spectre of the Gun was mentioned. I think the Menagerie was also one of the episodes. City on the Edge of Forever. A lot of these classic TOS episodes that you weave in, and even some of the technologies like the lasers and communicators and such.
Yeah, the character that I've created is kind of a reflection of me in as much as, and I'm going to back up for a second. Several years ago, there was a book that was out, and it wasn't fiction, it was nonfiction, but it was titled something like Everything I Learned in Life, I Learned from Star Trek. In many ways, I view life through the prism of what I learned from the likes of Star Trek, etc. So I imagined a character that would be the same way, but he would be able to draw on his almost encyclopedic knowledge of Star Trek to resolve certain issues that affect the security of the United States. Cord Devlin is actually a freelance intelligence operative. He has worked with the NSA as well as the CIA, and he's always called upon when some weird stuff like the one I described, where working phasers are discovered. He gets involved in it, and he has the mindset to deal with it and perhaps eventually divert any threats that might come up that threatens either the US or the world or humanity in general. Like any of my books, whether they're Cord Devlin or not, to be honest, the way I approach any of my writing is just to play a lot of what if scenarios out in my head to come up with the stories. And for the Cord Devlin series, the question is always that seeds me is what if Star Trek was real? And what if certain episodes of Star Trek was not only real, but interjected themselves in the 21st century in our lives? So the characters, including Cord Devlin, just come to me based on who I know and interact with in life and sometimes in what I read about in fiction. The plots of any of the stories, I almost literally dream up after I start musing over some of these what if scenarios. Like in the case of the latest novel that I just wrote, titled Cord Devlin, From Trekkie to Elite NSA Acid. The biggest chapter of that book started off as a standalone story. And I just dreamed up, you hear those stories about alien abductions, but what if aliens abducted something that they couldn't necessarily deal with, that they bit off more than they could chew? In other words, what if they, in the chapter of this book, what if they abduct a vampire, just to go crazy and sort of X-File-ish?
And I got that impression when I was reading that chapter. It harkens back to the spirit of the X-Files.
And you came by it honestly. I think my friends said the same thing. When I started to think along those lines, then I thought, well, this is, again, putting the story together in my head. What if the aliens were actually Telosians? And then if they're Telosians with that Star Trek theme in the 21st century, then there has to be Cord Devlin to deal with it. Because, as you know, I've already written several short stories with Cord Devlin, the Trekkie, dealing with interventions in our reality from a parallel reality where Star Trek actually exists, or the Federation, or the Klingons, Romulans, etc. So basically, I took the story and wrote it all out, and then realized I got to tack on more to the beginning so that I can explain Cord Devlin came from in all this. So I, for the first time, fleshed out his biography, which I didn't do in the previous short stories. And I took those short stories, as well as the novel Ghost of Forgotten Empires, and put together a timeline and a bio, and even developed some of his ancestors to kind of explain, well, here's how Cord Devlin came to us, and here's why he is the way he is. So that kind of gives me the palette to then start writing other stories. But like I say, the novella is the very first time, from Trekkie to Elite NSA Asset, that I ever tackled organizing Cord Devlin's early life and into a story.
I read the short stories and I read that novella as well. I enjoyed how they all connected with Star Trek, but it was also his own adventures that is influenced from Star Trek, but it's also adventures outside of Star Trek as well.
Right. Yeah, the character's fun to write, but I'll tell you, it is tough when you've already assigned him a bit of a history, and then remembering that history as you develop more stories for him. And thankfully, now that I've written that last novella, I'll be able to use it kind of as a reference book for when I get back to him and do some other stuff.
It's always good to have that foundation or the backstory that you can continue the character development as you write further then.
For sure.
Yeah, great. Were there any challenges that you had when you were writing, either Cord Devlin or just writing in general?
There's always challenges. Friends of mine are surprised at this. I never have an issue coming up with stories. It's either wake up with them in the morning or dream them up during the day as I daydream. But at least in the case of Cord Devlin, I have to be conscious about being faithful to the Star Trek canon. And Star Trek, as you know, has been around for such a long time that when you write about it, you want freshness, new story ideas, etc. But at the same time, you also have to maintain that familiar feel that people love about the series and the franchise. And I understand that Star Trek readers and directors and producers have to do that. And I get that. I have to do that as well. But, I'm always daring to insert something new. And whenever you do that as a writer about anything, you potentially disappoint some of your fans that have gotten used to your characters or storylines.
I would imagine it would be delicate but important to get that balance, because you don't want to write something that has been written before. So you want to keep expanding either the character, your skills, the plot, or the stories, keeping in the spirit of the old one. I guess that's why sequels sometimes it doesn't always hit, because some people say it's too much like the original one, or the first movie is always the best, and then it's just hard to replicate that magic. Yeah.
Right. It's tough, but that's why writing a character or a storyline for the first time, it's relatively easy. There's no rules. You can do whatever you want. And then when you have to remember those same things for the second, third, fourth, or whatever iteration you do, that's the challenge.
Looking back at your library of work, if you could change anything, or if there's anything that you've learned since you've started writing, what would it be if you want to go back and do something different?
Yeah, I wish I knew everything I knew now back then.
Experience, right? Experience.
Right. According to some editors that I've respected for a long time, I'm happy to tell anybody that they say I'm a better writer now than I ever was. And my question was, well, why couldn't I have started out that way? But I guess them hammering on me helped me along the way too.
I guess getting all that experience, you could reap the rewards now then.
I hope so.
I was wondering, do you think you would incorporate Cord Devlin in like a TNG or Deep Space Nine or sort of 90s Trek? Because I think At least the ones I've read was a bit more focused on TOS.
And that's a great idea, Peter. As a matter of fact, I'm just going to write that down.
Let's just jot that down.
But yeah, I certainly loved most of the Star Trek series, and Cord is an aficionado on most of them as well. So yeah, I probably will do that. I do envision an anthology of short stories with him instead of one long book or novella. I have a bunch of mini adventures like the 3 that you read before the current novella. And a couple of ideas is that he discovers the real truth about Gigantopithecus sightings in North America, in other words, Bigfoot. And I'm just kind of fleshing that out in my head as I write down some other ideas. But in another, he helps a man who doesn't know he's been turned into an android by Dr. Roger Corby, if you remember.
Oh, okay.
I've got a bunch of thoughts, and some of that is already written down. As a matter of fact, I think at the very end of this current novella, the Cord Devlin from Trekkie to Elite NSA Asset, I do hint at the Bigfoot story that may be coming.
Yeah.
So, but it truth be told, it's not my current work in progress. I've got another series that features a character called Brett Kovac. Or if you can picture a larger, more dangerous Humphrey Bogart in the film noir movies, that Kovac is, and instead of dealing with Maltese falcons and stuff like that, he actually helps people recover loved ones who've been abducted by aliens. And he's back in the 50s, but by a little quirk, he does find himself in modern times, and I won't give that away. But
you have to read the book, right? You have to find out what happens.
So there's 2 books out on him already. One is obviously called Brett Kovac, and Roswell Meets Noir is the second book, and I'm working on a 3rd book right now about that.
That segs into the next question, which is, I know you've written some other books. Maybe you could talk about the ones you haven't had a chance to talk about yet.
Sure. I kind of organized them into series, and one of them, and I think you mentioned it before we were on the air, but Sherlock Holmes is a character that I love, and perhaps because he's observant and I'm not, it's like a superpower to me that he notices these things and then obviously deduces certain facts from them. And when I write him, I swear I somehow feel more observant. At least that's what I tell my wife anyway, but I don't know if she believes that. But when I write him, I vicariously live through that character, pretending that I too can do what he does. There's 2 books like that. There's a short Adventure of the Moon Gate. And then I actually placed them in another story that I had a heck of a great time writing, where he takes on a client, Tim Cratchit, an adult Tim Cratchit from Christmas Carol. And Tim Cratchit has been accused of murdering his old mentor, Ebenezer Scrooge. And as you know from Christmas Carol, Ebenezer Scrooge is redeemed. He takes good care of the Cratchits. And then somewhere along the way, he dies. And somebody accuses Tim Cratchit, at least, of foul play. So he goes to Holmes to try and clear his name. Now, the events of Christmas Carol are about 50 years before the Sherlock Holmes stories. And so Tim Cratchit is approaching Holmes well after Ebenezer Scrooge's death, and only recently had it come out that the Cratchits might have had something to do with his death, and his business is suffering as a result. So that was a lot of fun to write. Mashing up 2 famous characters like that, I got a big kick out of.
And also just wanted to mention that Data on Next Generation is Sherlock Holmes fans. So
that's right.
there was a few episodes like Elementary Dear Data.
Yeah.
That one in particular focused on Sherlock Holmes, but there was a couple of other episodes that acknowledges Data interest.
My favorites, especially with Professor Moriarty. They were fun. So that's one series. Another series is Kennedy, the President Kennedy from another reality comes into ours in the book, The Kennedy Effect. And that's something that was kind of therapeutic for me to write. I remember with both my parents being Irish nationals, they looked upon Kennedy like a saint. And I was born in upstate New York, but I didn't understand what was going on until I got a little older. And then I developed an appreciation for him, and then a sadness for the fact that he was killed before he really truly gained his full potential. So the Kennedy effect came from that feeling, and I try to fill in the blanks a little bit. It's a parallel reality story. There's a short story also concerning Kennedy that's could reasonably be considered a primer for the novel. And that was fun to write too. There's another series that I'll probably add to as well that I call my Vertropicus series. Vertropicus is what Earth is called after time travelers escape Earth's destruction in our future by about 100 years, go back and settle in the Cretaceous period, and continue to build and develop a star-spanning human domain throughout the galaxy. So I set a bunch of stories there, and that star-spanning empire is unfortunately closer to the Klingon Empire than the Federation. As a matter of fact, that series has a bit of a tie-in to my other books, Ghost of Forgotten Empires, as well as the very first book I wrote called Future Perfect. So that was cool. So basically, these time travelers go back and develop a technology far in advance of our own, enough to conquer a good chunk of the galaxy, and then impose a certain peace on the resident aliens, whether they want it or not.
When I was reading the Cord Devlin from Trekkie to NSA Asset, that you had references to some of your other works as well. It's almost like everything is connected.
It keeps it easier for me, and it's also something called cross promotion. That's somebody who encouraged me to do. So I took them seriously. A lot of times I refer to my other stuff.
Yeah, that's good. As an author, you have to keep those things in mind.
I try to.
Yeah. I'd like to talk about the publishing aspect of being an author. What you do to get from your thoughts and ideas, writing it down, to having it be available for readers. I know in decades past, it was probably harder because there wasn't online publishing. Everything was in print and had to work with publishing houses. But now it's changed, I imagine, because of everything that's been, available over the last 10, 20 years.
I'll tell you, Peter, if I had to type things out on a typewriter with ribbons and
kind of like Cisco, right? With Far Beyond the Stars or something like that,
right,
when he had to type it
exactly,
all
yeah,
out. Yeah.
I would never have taken this up.
Mhm.
So in one sense, writing has never been easier between, as you say, the word processing, digital publishing, etc. There's a lot of things that make has made life easier for writers. But in another sense, however, most authors are kind of on their own now in terms of promoting their own work. And there are some exceptions to that, of course, the likes of Stephen King and some of the better known writers today, they don't have that. But if you're not in that top 1 or 0.1% of writers, you do have to become very good at your own marketing, your own PR, social media, and a plethora of acronyms to get yourself noticed by the likes of Google and Amazon. It's a challenge for me, and I'm still learning, to be honest. Search engine optimization, pay-per-click, all these acronyms that if you went to marketing school, and not just marketing school when I was going to school, but marketing school these days, you know this off the top of your head. But for me, it's a learning experience. But once I've mastered one technique and put it to good use and see the results of it, that's kind of fun as well. So for me, certainly the writing is fun. If you could believe it, I even like to edit my own work. The marketing of it, not as much fun, but it can be if I see some return on my effort. And I think we first met on Twitter, and that's kind of fun because I get to exchange quips and riff on favorite series characters about Star Trek. So that's not like work at all. But some of the other things, like developing a following on Facebook, which I still don't get, really, that kind of stuff, that for somebody of my vintage is still challenging.
That's interesting. I didn't realize that in the past, authors had PR folks or agents or publicity people that could help with that. But now, for better or for worse, the authors are less dependent on having someone to do their marketing or their advertising. So they have to almost like a jack of all trades, doing a little bit of everything to get your name out there.
And truth be told, publishers want you to know that stuff. There may come a time when they approach me and say, we'd like to sign you up to a contract or something. But that won't happen until I get a certain minimum level of success on social media or some marketing prowess that they can recognize. It's interesting too, because I don't have, and I'm speaking obviously about myself because I'm most familiar with myself, but I don't have a problem getting up and talking in front of people. And it's not something that a lot of other folks enjoy, but I don't mind it. I've been on local TV, I've been on national radio, etc. But even that doesn't necessarily impress a publisher. They want to know that you're good at search engine optimization and getting your books and sites ranked highly on Google.
Would you have any advice for a Star Trek fan who wants to start writing and self-publishing Trek fiction? Maybe share an experience or advice you have. Any of our listeners who is thinking of doing that?
I guess I'll give the same advice that I was given way back when I first started this. And there was a national radio host. His name is Jordan Rich. He's since retired, but he'd have me on his show every now and then. And he always advised me, just keep writing, just keep writing. And what he was saying was, whether your focus is on Star Trek or any other genre, romance, comedy, whatever, hone your craft. If you can do that, then it's a relatively easy thing to learn how to digitally publish, and you'll eventually learn, like I say, these digital marketing techniques as well. But until you get that writing style honed and acceptable to people who could help you market it and get it out to the populace, you've really got nothing. So that's step one. I remember my degree is in engineering. It's not.
Oh, really? Oh, well, it's not
Yeah,
in English or literature or anything like that.
not at all. As a matter of fact, English was like an abstract to me. It might as well have been Greek, in math and science, but English, not so much. And yet here I am as a writer. But
It's funny how things sometimes
it's
make
weird.
some twists and turns.
The first germ of an idea to become a writer for me was when I was in science fiction class in Northeastern way back when. I won't mention what year. And I went to my science fiction professor and I said to him, I've got an inkling. I'd like to take this on as more than just a hobby. And he referred me to one of his friends who was good at developing authors. So I took him up on his advice and I went to the professor's friend with a sample of my writing. And he ripped me a new one, not impressed in the least. And, I look back at it. And he was absolutely correct. I was a horrible, horrible writer, but that's only because I was an engineer and just was like two opposites. But after reading several books and taking courses and writing and rewriting and editing and getting advice, I eventually got to the point where I got this, and I'll never forget this from one of my editors when he said to me, it's a pleasure to work with you, as opposed to some of the other bozos that I have to edit. So that's when I decided, yes, I've made it.
Once you get a compliment from them, that's when you realize that I should be good now.
Yes, I'm at least a competent writer.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting how in your college years it wasn't what you were focused on, but then later on you pivoted and moved into this field as opposed to what you were studying for.
I will say this about that, Peter, that science, which was really what you focused on as an engineer in school, is certainly still what I'm focusing on right now to be accurate in my writing.
Michael, I'd like to get your opinion on the current state of the franchise. We have several new shows since 2017. A show has ended. One will be ending soon. There's a Section 31 movie that's coming out. So what are your views on current Trek? Is there any favorite series and just general views on that?
Well, first of all, let me say I'm looking forward to the Section 31 movie. So that hopefully that's coming not too far away. But I do like Strange New Worlds. I've seen both seasons. And I think we talked about a little bit about Captain Pike before. I love that character. And I get this classic vibe from it. Like they really do a lot with making it feel like the original series. I think they even have Pike go back to Rigel 7 at some point. And
yes, Among the Lotus Eaters, I think.
Was that what it was?
And, yeah. Yeah.
I think it's a terrific series. And the big driving part of it, again, is how is Pike going to deal with his fate, or will he avoid it? I think the end of the first season the episode when Pike, instead of Kirk, led the Enterprise to the Romulan neutral zone. And unfortunately, it turns out Kirk was the better man to that crisis. Yeah, it's terrific stuff. I liked Picard a lot. The 3 seasons. He's getting a little long in the tooth, but I was amazed how well he did at all those series. When they opened up, and I forget which season this was, but he was playing poker with Data.
That was premiere of season 1.
Oh yeah, I mean that tugged at my heartstrings. When Data was saying, "Why are you delaying?" and Picard was saying, "Because I don't want this to stop," and turned out to be a dream or something. So that was great. And then Data coming back in some of these later ones, and I think that battle he had in his head with Lore about who was going.
Oh, that was really good.
It was actually very reminiscent of a scene that I love in the books by Asimov called The Foundation. It was very reminiscent of that in terms of the battle going on in somebody's head. And boy, the writing was terrific in both the book and that series. Discovery, I just never got into. Redesigning the Klingons the way they did. Oh man, but I wanted to like it. I kept watching it, and eventually I decided. Now I have heard recently, and this sounds like maybe I could get back into it, that Discovery goes to the 31st century.
At the end of season 2, Discovery goes into the future.
Okay.
32nd century, and then seasons 3 and 4 take place in the future. I don't know if you heard, season 5 is actually going to be the final season. So it's already been announced that Discovery will be ending at the end of season 5. Paramount just announced that early April of this year is when they're going to start showing season 5. They actually brought the cast back to film an epilogue. What happened was when they finished filming, it wasn't announced that it would be the end. So that they filmed it not knowing that whether they will be renewed or not. But once they announced that it will not be renewed, they brought the cast back to film some extra scenes to provide an epilogue to the show.
Wow, interesting. It's maybe other series could take a page out of their book. But now that I think of it, I remember I was writing on Quora and I was asked this question, what do you think of Discovery and relative to some of the other series? And I wrote a response that seemed to be very popular, talking about the characters. And I showed a picture of the TOS main crew, the TNG crew, and then Discovery crew. And I said, which of these are the least likable? And that's, at least for me, that was the essence of why I didn't care for it. I just couldn't relate to those characters. Unlike any of the other, like DS9 or the Next Generation or the original series or Enterprise or Voyager, I generally could connect with those characters, but I couldn't do it with Discovery for some reason.
I like Discovery. It's spun off Strange New Worlds.
Yeah, that's true.
We wouldn't be where we are now without that show. It may be a symptom of the shorter seasons. Instead of the 24, 26 episodes we got back in the 90s, we only get 10 to 15 episodes. So it's not enough time to really dive into the characters. And I think the serialized method of storytelling, which is popular now, having one story, but going it across the season, there's not extra time to dive into the characters because the focus is on the story itself. So there's definitely some reasons why it makes it harder. We'll see what happens. Star Trek continues to be popular. I know it's undergoing transition now, especially with Paramount Plus and the state of streaming, which has been a hot topic, especially the last few months. So we'll see what happens. To wrap up, can you let our listeners know how they can contact you? They have questions, or where can they find more information about your novels and your work? That would be great.
Happy to do it. And first of all, my pleasure for being on your show, Peter. It was a lot of fun, and it's never a bad thing to talk about Star Trek in my mind. So listeners want to contact me. First of all, I'm active on Twitter these days, and my handle is at Michael J, the initial J, Foy, Foy. So that's at Michael J. Foy. It's easy if you go to my website. The Twitter connection is there as well as Facebook. And if you want to get on the mailing list, be a preferred reader, if listeners want to contact me that way, and they wouldn't mind a free Cord Devlin short story, they should go to michaeljfoy.com. Again, that's Michael, the initial J, Foy.com, and hit the big red button, and you'll be able to get my email address. And in return, I'll send you a free short story, perhaps the first, at least in timeline, Cord Devlin story that'll kind of give you a primer of whether you want to read any more. And that's with my compliments.
Thank you. It was great having you and giving our listeners a peek into the writing aspect of it. There's a lot of work that the authors have to go in, and you've kind of opened my eyes on the online marketing and the PR aspect of it, which I hadn't really thought about. So it was educational for me as well. Like I mentioned earlier, I read several of the short stories as well as the novella, and I enjoyed it, between connecting to Star Trek and reading it as a science fiction novel as well.
Good to hear.
Thank you very much, Michael, for joining us here on the podcast. I had a great time talking with you.
Thank you. Same.
And good luck with everything, all the future plans that you have related to your works.
Thanks very much, Peter. No, I'll see you on Twitter.
Okay, sounds good. And for me, my contact information, I am also on Twitter and I'm on Bluesky. My handle is at PeterTrek1, the number 1. I'm also on Mastodon under the handle at PeterTrek1 at universeodon.com. I have a short form Star Trek solo cast that's on Spotify, and the link is in my Twitter profile. And also, if you want to learn more about the Trek Book Club, you can follow us on Twitter. The handle is Trek Book Club, where we read Star Trek novels and discuss them approximately once every 6 weeks over a weekend. This is Peter signing off. Live long and prosper.